And the goal of CS3 as a center is to promote the social sciences to advance social scientific inquiry at UMBC. We do that by promoting interdisciplinary collaboration, by providing funding for research, bringing distinguished scholars to our campus, and disseminating UMBC social science research to the broader public. We even have a podcast called Retrieving the Social Sciences, so please follow us. And it is my pleasure today to open the GIS seminar, Mapping Revolutions and Resolutions, a very cool name. And I say it's my pleasure more than a formality, but because I think this is a very UMBC kind of event for a few reasons. It is about interdisciplinary collaboration between a technical field, GIS, and the social sciences. You may know that UMBC has a reputation of being a STEM college, but we also do great social science as well. And I believe that collaboration between the natural and social sciences is what can guarantee that the production and use of technology will be socially responsible. Which brings me to another aspect of this event that makes it a very UMBC thing. We're also a community engaged university where public research is done for the public good. And I think that critical GIS is strongly aligned with that mission. So I hope that you are as excited as I am to learn more about it from Dr. Dylan Mahmoudi and Professor Ron Wilson. Dr. Mahmoudi is Assistant Professor of Geography and Environmental Systems and Director of the GIS Graduate Program here at UMBC. His research focuses on the nexus of regional economies, urban spatial structure, and the relational processes of accumulation and exploitation under capitalism. Professor Wilson is the Associate Director of the GIS Graduate Program and Instructor of Cartography and GIS courses at UMBC. His research interests are in critical cartography, neighborhood geographies, crime, housing, and urban development, and spatial statistics. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, everyone. And it's such an honor to be able to have Dr. Felipe Filomena introduce us, because CS3 has had such a strong relationship with GIS at UMBC for a long time. And in fact, CS3 got to introduce the Critical GIS conference when we held it in Baltimore in 2019. So it's awesome to kind of have that come full circle. It also signals kind of the importance that we place on social science. So this is, GIS at UMBC is not just a technical skill set. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We were already introduced, but my name is Dylan Mahmoudi. To my left is Ron Wilson. We team up to do the graduate program directing for the MPS and GIS. And it's been a pretty fun process to kind of build a GIS program from the ground up. What's the purpose of this talk? Well, the purpose of this talk is a couple of things. One of them is to do a dry run for a seminar series that we're going to start, where we're bringing in scholars from around the country to talk about the work that they do using GIS in novel and in interesting ways. And the reason that that's interesting is because we're at this kind of moment where there's theoretical advancements in mapping and theory practice, mapping theory and practice, that are kind of coalescing into something that isn't quite named yet, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And what we're going to try to do is kind of integrate some of these insights that we're seeing from different places into one kind of umbrella term. We're kind of calling that critical GIS, but we'll kind of pitch it to you in a little bit. And the reason that we're doing that is so that we can establish a more direct connection to the real world by interfacing research and practice, and the benefits that those research and practice can have for both society and the environment. This is a very different context than what might have happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. On the left is a quote from Eric Shepard, who said that in the 1990s, when someone was presenting a paper at the IBG, which is the British Geographies Conference, they had to apologize before presenting quantitative data. So that's how frowned upon quantitative data was looked at in some of the social sciences. On the other side is a quote from Perry Carter, who has a great quote where he says, "There was a time when many quantitative geographers were fond of saying, let the data speak for themselves." So this is the other side of that coin. But he makes a pretty astute observation that data do not speak, data are interpreted. And so our job as social scientists are to use our training and to use our mapping and research to kind of reinterpret things in what we would call a more just and sustainable future. I think it's worth talking a little bit about the kind of timeline of mapping from a kind of a critical perspective. There was a first wave of GIS, critical GIS, and critical cartography that really emerged in the 70s and 80s. And this is when geographers were really intrigued by the technology, but weren't really sure what its full capabilities would look like. But what very quickly happened is the more kind of positivist social scientists grabbed onto or glommed onto quantitative calculations and quantitative and mapping to promote kind of unjust futures without really realizing it. And that is what prompted a second wave of GIS, and that was based around critique. So the technology has grown, it's become widespread, and then in the 90s, this is again where that first quote from Eric Shepard came around. It says that the tone of these critiques is notably ornery and dismissive, attacking the often grandiose claims of GIS. So really kind of disregarding or eschewing GIS, especially from the work of geographers, which sounds crazy today. The kind of third wave of critical GIS was really informed by STS scholars and feminist STS scholars. And they saw that, their observation was that there were voices being left off of maps, right? And so it was very important to include more people in the process of map making itself. And so feminist GIS scholars and feminist geographers really pushed the frontier of public participation GIS and including more people in the design and development of maps so that voices weren't left out. And this is where we're at in this kind of weird fourth wave, or Sarah Elwood has called it a fourth wave, where we're broadening outside of our shell. We've taken the kind of critique and we've taken this idea of participation and we're kind of developing it more and being more explicit about our aims in using GIS for just futures. So there are three concepts, three kind of background disciplines that feed into what this timeline. There are critical cartography, critical GIS, and what we are calling critical quant. The takeaway from critical cartography has always been that there's power in representation, in absence and presence. Again, who's left off of the map, who's on the map. For critical GIS, scholars have focused on the process of map making, the labor, and the people that are included in development of that map. And finally, critical quant has focused mostly on data and methods and how they require interpretation. And this is kind of a classic conceptualization. But we're really right now in this moment where we have this thing, AI, ChatGPT, where these large language models are reflecting back some of the inputs that we've given them in ways that might revert back to our kind of traditional ways of thinking, perhaps even going back to how to the way GIS was used that prompted some of the critiques in second wave GIS. So that's why I'm saying, well, perhaps this is a fourth wave, and this is not something that I'm proclaiming or that Professor Wilson is proclaiming. It's something that Sarah Elwood, kind of one of the most important feminist GIS scholars, has said. She says, this work is epistemologically and politically consistent with prior waves of theory and praxis from qualitative and feminist GIS, their engagement with feminist relationality, and their enrollment in anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-cis heteropatriarchy interventions of many kinds. So that's a pretty profound statement on where this next wave of GIS is going. And there's a lot of social science baked into that phrase, right? Into that quote. So it may be insufficient to call it fourth wave. We're going to just call it fourth wave for now, and we can kind of talk about what that might mean toward the end. But this moment has strong ties to broader normative movement, broader normative transformations within the social sciences. Okay, so I'm going to kind of use this framework as we go through the rest of the talk. With critical GIS, what we do is we think about it in combating systemic patterns of spatial inequality. We rethink the core goals of GIS around social and environmental justice. We incorporate technology history and geosurveillance. We incorporate participation and community engagement. And we integrate the kind of subjectivity of critical quantification, those acknowledgements, and including technological orientations, epistemological and ontological. So this is getting towards kind of the STS side of GIS. But we're also looking for ways to open up new markets for speculation in terms of data and location services. So we're using that and critiquing, reflecting back on all of these different moments. This is the thread that's going to unite things together. So I'm going to hand it off there to Professor Wilson. Did you want to this slide or you go?
All right. So a lot of you, many of your students in my class, you've heard a number of these things before, and that's kind of what this seminar series is part of, is to sort of bring that home a little more outside of the classroom that you've been hearing about this. So to follow along with what Dr. Mahmoudi was talking about, is that this is part of the STS training. And it is part of something that is in the GIS program where we don't have a formal class for it, but we do have a aspect to it where we're doing this series of seminars to bring that science and technology studies to those of you who are either in the GIS program or are getting a GIS certificate, which you will be interfacing with the GIS program, or those of you who are just got lucky enough to be trapped into a GIS class that has to be at one of these seminars during the semester. Because we are going to have one during each semester. As Dr. Moody had said, we are going to be bringing in some other folks from all kinds of backgrounds to emphasize what we teach in our program. So without getting ahead of myself, I want to say a number of things that relate to that. And as we mentioned, we're looking at transforming. The GIS program, when we started it, as anything naturally when we start something, is often focused on the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, making it work, showing people how to use these kinds of things. I had that experience when I ran the Crime Mapping Research Center, which then became the Mapping Analysis Public Safety Program, is when I took it over, all the stuff had been, here's how you do it, here's how you use it, and here's what you make of it as you're using it. But that soon gets old and nobody really has a need for that other than just regular trainings. And our research center was to advance the discipline. So the GIS program started out like that. It did its purpose. Some of you are faculty from that time. And we were just doing classes of sort of, here's GIS, here's how to use it. We had a more stronger technical side, but with Dylan and I moving into more of the social science aspects of it, we're looking at it to be more transformative as a science program. So we're looking to, impact the people's lives and livelihoods. We're not just trying to do this to get you careers going out there and to be competent professionals, everything. We're here to try to show you how your work will impact people. And that's one of the benefits that I've had is that even though I've been in academic work all my life, it's been in either local or federal government where I've been able to apply it right to the ground and be right where the people are that I'm trying to help. So it's sort of been sinking in through most of my life, whereas this is where it really matters. So with that, you're transforming people's lives and livelihoods, but at the same time, you're engaged in the society that's out there. You know, a number of the projects here in the geography department, as well as what we're going to be doing in the GIS program, is getting out there. For those of you who are in the GIS program or even the GIS certificate, you're going to be going out in a capstone project where you're going to be engaging in the real world and having to deal with folks. And some of our classes are going to be designed in such a way as you will be doing participatory kinds of things. So it's about getting out there, because you need to hear from the people that are out there. I mean, because that's a part of critical GIS is that we're trying to bring the voice from the people who are out in those communities who aren't heard as much, who have a disadvantage of low political capital in being able to make their voices heard. So we need to get ourselves out there. So the other aspect to it is that we don't just operate socially amongst ourselves. We engage in spaces, and we have an impact on the environment, and that environment impacts us as well. So we need to factor in that environmental aspect too, because we're interacting with it, we're changing it. It may be less in front of us oftentimes because there's a social aspect to it that seems to take front and center stage, but we're looking to make sure that the environmental aspects are captured there too. So the GIS program education at UMBC should really be thought of as an analytical and technical degree, but with a social science foundation. So that's why we're going to be studying a number of the things that we're doing across our classes, not only just in our analytical classes, but the technical classes will have an aspect of these as well. So and we're also trying to use this as an opportunity to reach out to the rest of the university and get them involved. Well, the reason is simple. Why are we going to reach out to the rest of the university and even other university systems? Is because GIS just isn't for geography. Now, this sort of idea originally came from an old, I think it was Richard Hartshorne, was it, that came up with this concept of geography is the mother of all disciplines. But I thought that was kind of pompous all the time. I'm a philosophy of science minor, and I studied a lot of that. And it shows geography in the center as a big circle, and it's like a big Venn diagram that shows all the other social science disciplines and even physical sciences discipline around it. And I was like, yeah, I get what you're talking about, but this is kind of overkill. So back when I was thinking this and trying to promote this at the previous university I used to work at the University of Michigan. I had a research team that I used to come up with this graph that showed the growth of of GIS and spatial analysis in the social sciences. And so we scoured through 4 different social science and academic databases, and we showed pretty much the growth of GIS was pretty substantial coming around 2000 when sort of computational burst onto the scene. And then suddenly all these departments use it. And then most notably, public policy kind of latched onto it more than any of the other social science disciplines, which makes sense because a lot of public policy is place-based. And so it's not all place-based, but place plays a major role in it. And we have to, they grabbed onto it. Now, I tried to use AI to help me with the rest of this study, and it was a bit of a failure. As a warning about using AI and sort of those ethical considerations about it. So as I asked ChatGPT and I asked Google Bard to give me the actual numbers and percentages of the same criteria that I did with my research team about finding those abstracts. And you hear all this thing about the large language models being plugged in to the databases out there. I told them the 4 databases and I gave them the exact same criteria. ChatGPT was actually honest enough and says, I don't have access to these databases. I can't do it. Google Bard, on the other hand, sort of rephrased the back to me saying, oh, sure, I'm able to get the information that you want. Here's the growth in the social sciences across these years. Here are the percentages. And I started looking at it and I noticed, I was like, these look pretty linear in the numbers. And so I started plotting it out. Sure enough, all Google Bard was doing was getting some number from somewhere and estimating. It was just basically a linear projection. And so while it shows kind of an overall growth, this can't be trusted. So it's a lesson about AI in doing these things. Although I do believe that it has grown. I mean, I have seen other quotes out there. No one else has done this other than somebody alongside me way back when, and we matched our work up, and it matched. So we know there's growth out there. We have yet to do it. Hopefully for the next year's series, we'll get some funding to actually make that real. So given the growth in this GIS across the social sciences, well, why shouldn't you be trained in social science aspects? I mean, we're not trying to supplant our program with being a social science, but many of the things that you're going to be doing out there are going to be requiring you to use social science skills. So if we're going to be transformative, like we've been talking about and we've been advertising and we've been telling all of you about, then we need to build it into our program. And that's what we've been doing. So there's lots of aspects to our program, but we're going to focus on 3 of them in relation to social sciences. We're going to talk about the importance of theory, the importance of methods, and the importance of ethics. Because if we're going to be helping the constituents that we want to really help, then we need to take all these 3 things into account so that we can make our work defensible, that we can make our work robust, and we can make it impactful. So it starts off with theory in the sense of, you students from our program will be able to recognize the theories and understand what they mean and how to apply them. Methods put you into a planning phase where you're looking to be more thoughtful about going along the way. One particular class that we have takes you down a rabbit hole to realize what happens and what you have to do to correct if you don't plan properly. So, and then ethics is something that is actually part of the development of professional service at UMBC is like, it has to be part of your program. But it was just kind of something that Dylan and I were like, hey, we want to do that anyway, so that kind of fits. So it's about understanding that your work really does have an impact on people. And I've got examples in the end that show that, because I've been fortunate enough to have been on the ground in my career to see how that happens. And some of it, watching some of my colleagues make statements about trying to help people in ways that is kind of inconsiderate. So it's what that instance was actually what made me think about why this is important and why you need to understand that you may be going into an office every day, but your work does change people's lives. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So the root of it all is theory. I come from an educational training, which was mostly economists and criminologists who always start out with, what's your theory? What's your theory? Why are you doing this? What's the root of why you're doing it? Rather than just coming up with a research question, you need to know the theories behind what we do. And when it comes to GIS, it is a tool and a science that works in the geography world. So one of the things that I've found in a lot of my own GIS education, GIS courses, other GIS programs, is sort of this lack of geography teaching, especially, and a lot of them had that, but a lot of them were skipping over the theories. So these are the 4 concepts that you in my classes have seen this, are important to understanding what it is you're analyzing and what the results ultimately mean in the end. Spatial organization is why things are occurring where they are. That whole structure of the environment out there sort of dictates where things will and won't happen through economic, social, and political policies and pressures and various other things that shape the environments that we're in, which leads to spatial interactions between places. And that's how things transfer from one place to another. They don't stay stagnant. Then spatial dependence is like, how strong are those relationships in the places that they're at, as well as the variation in spatial heterogeneity of the events that cluster, pattern, and change across space. So we've talked about this before. Those of you in my class have heard it, but what you don't know, what I may have not have communicated, is like what happens without those geographic concepts. So you with spatial organization, if you don't understand that principle and understand why there's things, you really can't tell anybody. If they ask you, why are these things occurring where they're occurring? I mean, I've seen that in real life. It's like, I see people turn results in. It's like, do you have any idea why they're turning them in there? This is like, no, we really don't. This actually comes from a crime analyst group that I used to work with in the police departments, where they're on the front lines of seeing the actual conditions of the environment change, because 311 calls that come into police departments and county services, it's not just crime. Police don't actually get calls for crime services most of the day. They get calls for other things and helping in public service in a lot of ways that are not necessarily crime related. So we started asking him, was like, why are these coming from these neighborhoods and everything? And a lot of them was like, well, that's just where, they come from. Or that, oh, there's a lot of bars and tattoo parlors and pawn shops and things of that nature in there. But it's like, okay, what about that? They really couldn't answer those questions. And so they couldn't answer anything about why on this side of the city versus that side of the city. So it's understanding has to be able to tell why, because you don't want to be in front of people and they ask you questions like that and you don't have the answers for, especially if you're the person who's hired to bring solutions to them. So spatial interaction then is that if you don't understand what's going on in terms of how people and how things interact with each other and why they're interacting with each other, you can't explain that either. And you can't sort of communicate why things happen nearby. In criminology, there was always this assumption of that crime would spill over into neighboring communities if police would crack down on specific areas. It was almost like a universal belief that they thought was true. But it turned out in a lot of cases that it didn't happen. And that was because there was a lack of interaction between the places where crime was being cracked down on and the neighboring places around it. So there wasn't really an understanding of why there was this lack of interactions, as well as the interactions with farther off places where crime seemed to have risen. So understanding those interactions, you lose that ability to understand what worked in that crackdown. Or if you were to take it instead of a crackdown to providing resources into an area where you're hoping that there'll be spillover into that neighborhood next to it from some benefit resource. So spatial dependence is that if you see patterns, if you don't understand what spatial dependence is, you're not going to be able to tell anything about the relationships of what's going on there, because spatial dependence is either the result of something about those events that are nearby that are shared, and or that it's something about the geography that brings those things to those particular places. And it's important to understand those things so you can describe and craft solutions that properly affect the strength of that clustering that's going on. So if you don't do that, then you could be wasting resources because you're not either putting too much into it or you're putting too much into it where those resources could be elsewhere. So spatial heterogeneity, then, if you don't really understand that, then you kind of think this is a one-size-fits-all approach, and we go, okay, we're putting these resources here, and this we see as an example over there, the same kind of thing. We're just going to put the same resources here over here without knowing why they're different and why there is that variation there, and understanding that there is variation there, which all leads back to connecting to all these. These are not concepts that stand alone. These are concepts that are interlinked with each other, but understanding them has consequences in the real world of not being able to provide the kinds of solutions and services and answers that communities and local governments are looking for. So kind of think about it as working without theory is like trying to build that IKEA furniture without the instructions. I've never quite seen it go awry where the comedy shows you might have seen or skits where somebody builds something. I'm thinking Deadpool here, where the shelving unit collapses. But I have seen people put together this like, this doesn't quite work. The couch won't go back, or the table wobbles, or a shelving is off and it just doesn't quite look good or quite work right. So we want to send you out there a little bit more refined in terms of, I built this right. So how do you build those things that are right? Well, that's an important thing about methods. And this is where I like to make ourselves stand out amongst data scientists. Because data scientists take an approach that are very much like mathematical and computer scientists, where they're applying techniques and they're doing things, and they're useful, they're important, they're good. But I've seen data scientists in action where they don't have a methodological approach to anything, and they put forth these reports and these analyses, and leadership's like, what does all this mean? I just see a bunch of graphs, I see a bunch of tables, I see some connective words that tell me about these, but there's nothing here that is methodological or leads you from why you're doing this to how you did it to what you found and what your interpretations are. So methods are something that are important, that we're putting into our program, not both in the analytical courses, but also in the technical courses. Because, think about it, you write a program, you're writing a method. You're putting a bunch of techniques and tools together, you're putting a method together. So there's a lot of aspects of the social science practice that you are encountering in our program and our courses. I'm not going to go through every one of these because I want to get to more of the methodological things, but these are the kinds of aspects of social science practice that you're engaging in. Some of them more than others. You're not really engaged in empirical inquiry because you're not really out there gathering, analyzing evidence and being out in the field like some programs are, but you are encountering scientific methods. You are gaining an appreciation for theory. We are giving you ethical considerations. And we're also expanding into multidisciplinary. That's the whole purpose of our new GIS program is not to just sort of make you impactful, but to bring the other social science in so they can say, okay, we can get the benefit from that. Because I can tell you, being an interdisciplinarian myself, it's hard enough trying to keep up with the discipline that you are trained in, and let alone trying to keep up with multiple in terms of all the literature that's out there, all the analysis that is being done. So what we want to do is to make this multidisciplinary, not only draw from that ability by having our faculty be from different disciplines and different backgrounds, but also draw from that literature and give you the experiences from them so that you can see that. As well, in another discipline's training, they got to focus on their own discipline. And so if a lot of them who use GIS can benefit from coming to the GIS programming, getting enough of what they need to be able to go out there and do GIS as any professional GIS would. And be able to be confident in the work that they're doing, just like if you were going through the program itself. So, but the other important thing is bringing research to practice. That matters. When you see this stuff, for those of you who work for nonprofits or think tanks or been involved in the Peace Corps or anything, there's nothing like bringing that research to practice and being on the ground. You learn an immense amount. So I talk about our methodological approach, and I'm not going to go through this in the sense of like, all right, we've heard about methods before. It's a step, this step, and this step. Yeah, that's true. This does follow a particular step, wise in that fashion, but there's thoughts about it that we've had over the years that we want to bring to you that are nuggets that we've learned along the way. So one of the things is that, like I said, back from my training, the first question is, what's your theory? So what I'm trying to do, or what we are trying to do rather, is that we're trying to get you to think about these things ahead of time and conceptualize them. So the first text is like, you're going to put what your work is always going to be put in a context. Those of you in my class is like, what's the analytical question? What's the objective? You're trying to define what that is first, so it sets that framework so you stay within it and you don't get lost and focused. And unfocused, because it's easy to just start collecting data and start looking at it. You start putting it together and you start running analyses and you start doing all these things. And pretty soon your research is a mess and you don't know where to start or where you left off or if you picked up any of the holes. So having that objective defined starts to frame that. Then you define the question. All right, this is what I want to study. This is what I want to analyze. What is the question that we're going to answer? Because that's going to drive your analysis. And it can be more than one question, but you should have this overarching question that says, this is what I'm going to ask of my data and my research. This is what I'm going to peg my answer to. So it really sort of structures you right off the bat. So then you got to go out and gather your data. In the past, it was often just sort of, there wasn't a whole lot. Now there's like oodles of data out there. So you got to identify those data first, because you get to say, all right, I need to know which of these are going to help me and which of these are not. When I used to work at the data archives at the University of Michigan. And so we used to put on training sessions in the technical seminars in the summer. And as computation started growing and our data sets were coming in, especially from grant-funded research by the government, who you have to give your data to them to be publicly made available, is that people were starting to use data in unique ways. And we started to put together trainings to say, hey, this is what the data you're looking at is really about. This is how it's structured. Because a lot of people were getting data and they were telling us they were using it for these purposes, like, well, that data wasn't quite designed for that, so you're not quite going to get the answer that you're looking for. So we put on a bunch of classes that talked about how to use those data sets, how to combine them, how to examine, make sure they're going to be useful for you for what you're doing, and not sort of crossing that line that says, okay, this data is good enough, I'll make do and I'll put limitations in my results and that'll be fine. So identifying those sources is all not just saying, oh, this is the data I need, but it's not about critiquing not only the sources but the data. Say, does this data more closely represent what I'm trying to analyze or not? So that you can make the determination to say, I can't use this data set, or I can use this data set, but I need to massage it, or I need to transform it in some way to make it what I need, or combine it with another data set that gives me the answers that I want. Because that's the beauty of today's data sets that are out there, is that you have more options than any time in our history to be able to say, I'm going to put these data sets together. So then comes cleaning the data and knowing the data. My quantitative training was, as I mentioned, was under economists. They wouldn't let me touch any analyses until I'd gone through and I'd checked the range, I checked every variable, I checked the categories, I would check for errors and all this stuff. And then even then, once I got the data cleaned and everything, we spent time making just bar charts and histograms and other graphics, checking for outliers and wondering what those were and being able to explain that data before we ended up touching anything that spoke of an analysis. No regression and everything. And so learning that helps you, so when you do get into analyses, you see weird numbers come up, or you see something you didn't expect, you can say, I think I know why that's occurring. And so you can go back and say, all right, I need to work with this data. I can either get rid of it, or I can transform it, or do all kinds of things to it. But unless you know that data, you might not recognize those things. You might be putting research out there that is not going to be as informative or even accurate in what you're going to say, let alone sort of making you give up because I don't know what this issue is, leading you to make the incorrect approach in dealing with it. So then there's that analysis, and that's where the methods comes in. So methodological approach is not only this sort of overarching thing that we're talking about, but it's also in your analysis. You have to come up with a method section, like here's how I'm going to analyze the data. Here's the data I have, and so here's my method. So when you identify that method, you start picking the techniques that are going to work to help you in that method, not just say, oh, I like this technique, and that's pretty cool, or this one's pretty cool. I've seen a number of proposals come across my desk at the research center that was like, we're going to use hierarchical linear modeling. Okay, why? Well, it just seems appropriate for what we're going to do. And they provided us no methodological aspect of how they were going to use it, leaving us not confident that they were going to be able to apply this right and use the taxpayers' money for doing the kind of research that they were looking at doing. So, selecting the techniques is very much an iterative process with your design approach. So then finally is this like you generate those results and you evaluate these results. This is sort of something that is shocking to a lot of people when they get out in the real world, is that you have to do hundreds of analysis runs, hundreds and hundreds when you're doing real work out there. And I'm not exaggerating. It's an iterative process where you're generating the results, you're evaluating, you're making tweaks, you're getting other data, you're making changes to the data structure. You're all evaluating in this terms of, is this answering my question? Is this fit into the context of what my objective is? Because if it's not, eventually you're going to have to say, I need to do something different, or get other data, or come up with some other solution, or just stop, which nobody ever thinks about. So I kid you not, when I always worked with data that was ready for me. And so when I would see these proposals come in for people doing secondary data analysis, which is just gathering data and doing, modeling and analysis on it, they would say, oh, we're going to take 2 years to do this. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why does this take so long? And what ended up happening was I started doing my own research with the data that was at the archives, and it's messy. And you'll spend most of your time working with that data and going back through this generative process of generating results, evaluating, generating hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So you should be prepared for that kind of thing. And then finally, communicate. And an important part of that is archive your work. Store it somewhere, whether it be on your personal GitHub page or putting it in an archive or putting it somewhere where somebody else can get it. Because one of the things that science is having a problem with these days is replicability and reproducibility. It's causing all kinds of strife out there because people are asking the same questions and they can't reproduce somebody else's work. And so this throws science into a sort of a critical period of like, who's right? That doesn't help us. You know the public sentiment about scientists and experts out there these days. Part of that is our fault for not being transparent, not putting the work up there and being able to reproduce it. So put the work out there so people can see it. And so that's why one of the reasons we're doing our GitHub pages across for all the students across the program is to be able to have a place to put all that stuff, to be transparent, to archive their work, not only for their personal benefit, which is mostly the main driver, but also to keep your work into a spot to make it available if you so desire. And then document. So not only document to help, for the preservation, and I don't mean document, put it out in academic journals. Sure, you're going to need to do that, particularly if you go into an academic environment, but get it out there to the public. Because if you want people to use your research for the good of the communities, make it available outside of academic journals as well. So finally, I'm going to get to the last part of geoprocessing as the source of all things possible, ethics. And I don't mean that as sort of hyperbole. I mean that as a sense of GIS has the single ability to create new geographies in ways that truly are transformative, that give that power to the people not in the status quo. Because not only can they use GIS today for mapping, but they can say, we don't agree with these geographies that you put together because we don't think that's the way humans move or the way they behave or how they interact with each other or how they interact within environments. So now that we have all these GIS layers in there and we have these robust sorts of tools, we can crack any geography open and change it to anything that we want. And that comes with a lot of responsibilities in terms of making sure that those geographies actually do represent what you're trying to model, and if they're quantitatively being quantitatively capable of being measured, as well as qualitatively making sense. So I'm going to talk about some examples. So in an NIH study that I was involved in, we were looking at the impact of crime on people's well-being. This is what's called the Handles Project, is human and aging and development in neighborhoods across the lifespan. So this is a study that we did, and we had these fantastic measures. We had so many biomarker measures, and we had so many psychometric measures that we could actually measure the impact on people in ways that are often not possible because of the funding behind this study and its design. So we had, 500 some, 2,000 some participants across the program. And so we had to be very, very conscientious about how we were going to measure space. So if we're looking at the impact on somebody's well-being, we need to sort of assess what their awareness space is. And once we assess that awareness space, like we have in the circles around there, that's their awareness space. And it all came from measuring awareness space from other disciplines in the social sciences, because psychology and environmental psychology particularly pay attention to what's an awareness space. So we built from empirical evidence, and even from some of the data in there sort of gave us an idea about how big people see their neighborhoods and what affects them. So not only that, we had to measure how far these crime incidents, not only how many crime incidents were in their awareness spaces, but how close the crimes were. It's not just about how many are around you, it's about how close they are to you. And so if you don't measure this right, you really aren't going to be understanding how people are going to be affected by crime, or worse, get it wrong. Because crime is a stressor that does impact people in negative health ways, but can also lead to something called cognitive dissonance, where people get used to their environments and don't think much of it. and they don't really think they're in as bad a place as they think they are. There's a lot of studies out there that show what the police see in terms of crime activities and how dangerous or safe a neighborhood is. You go to the people in those neighborhoods, you find out they see the opposite. So, proper measurement. This is a study that I did with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD and the county executives of the city, where they were facing issues at the time in 2008 with regards to foreclosures and crime. Neighborhoods were falling into foreclosure, and I mean neighborhoods. I mean, there were some places that foreclosure really was making vacant neighborhoods, and they became run down and abandoned neighborhoods. And once a neighborhood gets in those kinds of conditions, it's exorbitantly hard to get them back. It takes a lot of resources, and there's a lot of things you just can't do to turn that around. So we were looking at where the relationship was between foreclosures and crime. And so one of the things that I insisted on that we do while we were doing this study is we look at it at two different scales. One using census tracts, which is the common neighborhood de facto unit for a neighborhood that's been classical in criminological and a lot of other social science research for decades. But now data is more available. We decided we're going to do it at the block level too, block group level too. So we did the analysis, and sure enough, if we'd have gone with the census tract level, we'd have been focusing all the resources from the county and the police department to the west of Charlotte-Mecklenburg on this side. But we caught this instance where we saw residential instability was going down, was going up as crime was going down, which didn't make any sense. The criminology and sociology literature is full of showing when you have residents or neighborhoods where you have people staying longer and live there longer and are interactive with each other, they're not unstable neighborhoods. So the analysis of the other one, the block group, showed more of what where the resources should have gone was on the complete other side of the county for the most part. And so now the relationship between residential instability and violent crime made sense from all the empirical research that sociology and criminology had uncovered for decades on that topic. And how do we know this? We did a sort of, we did a comparative analysis with more local level analyses and found that this matched anyway. So had we not, so for those of you who take the spatial stats class, that's what we do in that class is show you what happens when you don't make the right decisions. But that's in a lab. Here, if we had given them this, they'd have wasted resources, they wouldn't have solved the problem, and things were likely would have been more exacerbated. So the final one is the voucher holder program that I worked for while I was at HUD. So one of the things that I was charged with was looking at where voucher holders had been moving from 2000 to 2010 at the time. Because the purpose of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is to try to help people get away from concentrated poverty and get access to better resources and live in a less stress-free environment so that they can more self-actualize and get better jobs and have better places to live with more opportunities. So part of evaluating that program is, are voucher holders moving and making use of those vouchers, getting away from concentrated poverty like the intent is? Because we can't tell people where to live. We couldn't tell people, we still can't tell people where to live. So we have to look and see where they move. And what we found is that, you know, for those of you who study Baltimore, I've heard you all talk about, you're familiar with this pattern where the concentration of the African-American population is. We found that for the most part, voucher holders were not only staying within that area, within those areas, they were also staying within the same census tract. We found that they weren't moving much more than 1.5 miles to 2 miles max away from that. So that sparked our attention to sort of go out and find out why. There was literature out there, but we have local housing authorities, and we were able to talk to some of these people, and some of the research that came after this, particularly moving to opportunity, was that they don't want to move far enough away because they have all their social networks. They have all their familiar networks. They have a lot of resources that are social and familiar to them around them that they don't want to move too far away from. And particularly the Moving to Opportunity Project found out that when they did move too far away, they lost a lot of support and didn't find that things were any better for them. As a matter of fact, there was no effect from the Moving to Opportunity project in most cases that they uncovered. So GIS allowed us to create these geographies to see where they were, to see if they were staying within the confines of those particular areas. We were able to use GIS to track and create their movement patterns over time to understand where they were moving from. We found out that this was a closing of a housing community here that was being demolished. So they all kind of scattered from there, but a lot of them went and moved to the same places together. Most of these ended up moving, outside of other places, but nevertheless, we also found that a lot of them were moving to more diverse but more dense neighborhoods, which was a positive thing. This is what we found. But we also found that a lot of them were moving to less diverse places as well. So that's what's in the red. So the point of all this is to say this has real world consequences because policies are made from these analyses. Future research studies are made from these analyses. And why this really matters is that what we learned from this, I was in an instance where one of my colleagues wanted to just do an experiment that was place-based and put all these resources in that could have been harmful or been ineffective in a number of ways. And I tried to argue against it, but he was like, well, we should just do it and see what happens. These people's lives, they're not to be played with. And there are people that I've encountered who nonchalantly make decisions that do affect these people. And that came out in some research with one particular woman who was being interviewed from the program that said, you people think making these decisions is easy and that we've got the time and the resources to go along with it. If you're wrong, we lose that time and we don't have the ability to recover. And we're either worse off than we were or we're stuck in this new situation. So that's why we're bringing the ethical considerations to this program, where you're going to wrestle with those and at least try to understand and appreciate them, that the decisions you make need to be evaluated to say, how will this affect the people that we're trying to help? Oftentimes it's for the right purposes, but it can have unintended consequences. And even if it is the right intended consequences, sometimes it just doesn't go right. And you really should plan for those kinds of opportunities. So I was going to talk about generative AI a little bit, but I'm going to kind of just point out that we're using that in this program, but we want to teach you to use it responsibly, because the ways of doing business with research and science and programming, those days are over, in my opinion. And what we need to do is learn how to use the AI to sort of set a foundation for us and be critiqueful of it and make sure that it's giving you what you want and is not giving you something that's going to be impactful in a negative way. As Dr. Mahmoudi had pointed out earlier, we're now sort of seeing the reflection of years and years of stuff that we've been putting in our databases, and we're getting a little shocked at what's coming back at us. Yeah, I think a number of us aren't surprised at some of the sort of negative things that are coming out of this, both socially and environmentally, that we would have expected. So in summary then, our program is comprehensive. It's designed to put a social science foundation under your technical work so that you make work that is more defensible by grounding you in theory, teaching you systematic planning so that you're more rigorous in your approach, to fostering conscientiousness about the decisions that you're making. We're trying to be leaders in sort of moving the idea of critical GIS out into the environment. So yeah, we're pretty much trying to subvert the status quo and get the geographical thinking and map making into a different realm and into the worlds where the communities that we're trying to help can make use of it in better ways. So in the end, a lot of that's going to be through the map. So we want to make maps matter. Maps just kind of build towards that just and sustainable future that I think a lot of us are here for. So I'm going to end it on that. Thank you very much. So yeah, we are going to have seminars with way cooler people than us. So I hope you'll get. All right, so questions, comments, outright insults. Anybody online? Is anybody paying attention? Monitoring online? Any questions? Okay. All right, so that's about it. I'm going to say the rest of the time is to sort of mingle. Some of this was to, like I said, to get those of you who are new into the program. I mean, you had our orientation, but this is sort of giving you more of the in-depth highlights of what you're going to experience through our program. And for our faculty that are here, a chance to sort of get into more nitty-gritty about, what the new design of the program is and how that work fits in, your work fits in, your classes fit into our program, and sort of where we're going in that particular direction and stuff. So for those of you who are, in the GIS certificate program, you'll get the benefit of those. And as those of you who are here to potentially come and do classes here, either as a certificate or just taking classes, please spread the word and then reach out to us.
There's food.
Yeah, and there's food. And there's somebody on Discord.
Yeah.
That's not my Discord. Is that your Discord?
It's not a
Oh, that's yours.
I usually basically I usually go offline. Do you have a question?
Dr. Mahmoudi, help.
Now someone's doing it just to troll.
Someone had raised their hand. It's probably saw it pop up there.
That was
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, hang out. Please eat the food. Take some if you want. And let's, get a chance to talk with each other. For those of you, the students, you might just get a chance like, all right, class is ending early tonight. It's only 7 now instead of 8:30, which we normally go to. But hang out if you want and chat with us. Oh, wait, before you go, we did have the raffle. So I think I got everybody.
Does everybody have a ticket?
I think
Okay.
everybody did. So, wait, there is one person who came in. Wait, Camille, did I get you one? Okay, I think we're gonna, so I think you got one, right? Now we're gonna make sure that you're, everybody else I think you got, right? So I'm gonna shake up the hat and let Dr. Jamudi pull it. So anyway, what we're raffling off is those of you who know Edward Tufte, the guy who came up with the idea of graphical excellence and put out 4 books total on the subject, came out with a new one called Seeing with Fresh Eyes. And there's a lot of geography aspects in this and spatial aspects to it too. So we thought it was the appropriate book to try to raffle off for those folks that were in person. And so draw it.
It's a lot of pressure. Okay. 113-2015.
Thank you to everyone that joined us virtually. We're going to close the meeting now.